Hey everyone, welcome back to Dev Interrupted. I'm your host, Andrew Ziegler, developer advocate at Linear B, and joining me today is Vikram Chatterji, co-founder and CEO of Galileo. Vikram has been on the front lines of the AI revolution for many years, from leading product management at Google during the birth of Transformers to building tools that help engineering teams confidently evaluate and deploy AI systems. Here's the crux of today's conversation. Engineering leaders are stuck between a rock and a hard place. They know they need to experiment with AI to stay competitive, but they're under immense pressure to justify those costs. All the while, AI evolves so rapidly that today's wrong move could cost them tomorrow's opportunity. That's why I'm so excited to chat with our guest today and learn how to approach these dual problems. Vikram, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Andrew. Super excited to be here.
Likewise, let's jump right in. Starting with the biggest challenge currently facing engineering leaders, AI being that moving target and experimenting feeling risky, it's a big barrier to adoption, and the fear of making the wrong investment is ever present. How do you think leaders can take the first steps without putting themselves or their teams in a bad position?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, AI is. I've always thought about AI as it's another tool in your arsenal, right? Even before generative AI became a very big thing, with classical machine learning and with NLP, um, it was it was never about like, hey, you have to use this thing. It was more about what's your use case, and based on that, is this a good fit for your use case? Um, Now, I guess the difference is what we're seeing with a lot of engineering leaders that we talk to. There's a lot of top down pressure to just use AI for the sake of it. So to get to your point about the rock between the rock and a hard place, um, it's very important for engineering leaders to think about what are the heuristics, right? That is gonna help me figure out, is this something that we should be even going ahead with? And that includes things like, what does the business need? Because what I've seen is folks just do a massive hackathon within their org, and you're going to
Mm-hmm.
get 100 ideas just given how open-ended AI can be right now, right? In terms of whether it's generation of text, whether it's generation of images, or completion of a task with agents, you get 100 use cases. But it's very, very important for them to then go back to product and business owners to figure out which one of them should they prioritize. And also on the back of that, which one of them can you actually get out the door very quickly? And that's kind of where the operational rigor has to kick in of like trying out X number of ideas very, very fast. So you have to have that machinery in
Mm-hmm.
place and the ability to push back and say that, hey, maybe I don't need to use AI at all. But when I do, here's how I need to do it. And at that point, we can talk about this more, but we have to think it through in terms of, if I succeed, what does that mean for me in terms of the number of engineers I need for this, the evals, the cost of productionizing this thing at scale. So there's a bunch of things that people have to think about, and a lot of trade-offs at the onset itself.
So it sounds like in balance with that proliferation of ideas, you really need an evaluation framework or a way to understand and extract scenarios that are maybe have a higher ROI or a higher impact on your business and focus on those. Because I think that's kind of part of the problem too, is you're drowning in possible solutions and everyone can come up with maybe a way to integrate it in some way. But is that the most effective way? Is that where we should focus our attention? And the more attention you put on something, it can skew then how the rest of your organization is using and thinking about AI. So those decisions, especially early on, they're really impactful. And
Yeah.
how would you advise, or what habits do you think make for somebody to be able to evaluate and de-risk that experimentation? Like what are those tools that those kinds of people are always using again and again to do that well?
Yeah, it's a great question. I will say it depends a lot on the organization, and you have to just know your organization well. What do I mean?
Mm-hmm.
What do I mean by that? So if you're a big bank, right, the um, the amount of harm that can happen if you put something out there in the consumer world with AI and it misfires is very, very large. It can literally derail your entire bank's reputation. For a commoditized entity like a bank, you're gonna be out of business very quickly, right? It's gonna hurt your business really, really hard. Um, On the other hand, if you're, let's say, a DoorDash or an Instacart, the the bar is probably a bit lower, because not to say that they have a low bar in general, but if something goes wrong with their chatbot or something like that, it's not going to be the end of the world, because they're not dealing with people's money. They're dealing with hungry people, which is
Right.
bad, but they're not dealing with people's money, and so it's the bar is a bit lower. What
And
that
maybe you
so what?
didn't get my burger, but my
Yeah,
bank account didn't have like an unauthorized transaction or something. They're totally
yeah.
different stakes.
They're totally different stakes. And so what I've seen as a result of that is when you talk to these large enterprises, they're very, very excited about generative AI, and they're very excited to add agents and everything else. But they're taking a very, very careful crawl, walk, run approach to it, which I think is good. What I'm seeing with the other companies where they are earlier stages, they're tech first. Let's say, as an example, like a DoorDash or like an Instacart or like an Airbnb or a Twilio, they're taking a much more experimental approach to this, right? Like, let's try things out. Let's see how it goes. Let's see how we feel. It's very much on the lines of, just build fast, break things, learn quickly. And that's really led to them kind of figuring things out as they go, and which is also useful when as this industry is moving super quickly. So based on the organization, I've seen like the barrier to entry from a fault tolerance perspective is different. Now, within that, if you're an engineering leader at a faster moving company, uh, you know, if you're all about experimentation and going fast, then the question becomes, how do you plan well? And there is a certain crawl, walk, run there as well, to be honest, Andrew, because what we're
Yeah.
seeing there is you have to think about, is it going to be 15 use cases, 10 use cases? Like, you have to have some forecasting there, because once based on the forecasting, you have to do a couple of things. You first think about the compute costs, and then staff yourself with enough, I don't know, A100s, and have that like available for you so that everyone can just build. Otherwise, everyone's going to come back to you and say like, hey, where's my GPU at? So you have to have like X amount of compute and give that out very judiciously. You then have to think about like, how can you optimize the compute, and start to invest in tooling at that layer to minimize the cost of compute. And then comes the eval piece, which is kind of what Galileo does, where you have to think about how do you create the right kind of guardrails in place for like an AI CI/CD process, uh, and then basically go to the teams and say, awesome, all right, you want to launch things, you want to experiment with things. Here's the stack that you can use. Go knock yourself out, right? And some people will use the entire stack, some won't, but you have to create that entire like that enablement almost within the team before they can like go crazy.
That's a big unlock. So let me try to unpack this playbook, because I think there's a lot of really interesting tips in here. One of them being, first and foremost, understanding your company culture, their risk tolerance, and what they're doing. And understanding that there's a big difference between a traditional enterprise and a digital native company experimenting with AI right now, especially with different levels of risk within what they're working on. So it's about understanding your own company, your own environment, the level of risk and the tolerance for experimentation. But then getting into that, crawl, walk, run loop that's going to get you up and get you moving on this process. It's about creating the actual resources to enable those teams to make effective tools. And so if you're going to create a way for them to grow within your company, you have to think about resourcing them and prioritizing them based upon, again, maybe the profile of your company culture. So it really does start with understanding your culture.
Exactly, and you hit on a good point. It's the culture, it's the people, it's the again, it comes down to like also the business that you're running, whether you've been an Instacart or a DoorDash. Again, going back to that example, they have many different ways of instituting generative AI, but maybe it's a different company that really like doesn't have those many use cases, and that's okay. So you kind of have to look at all of those different angles and then figure out um, how you want to act, and how quickly you want to act. But it does stem with that. As an engineering leader, I would say like step one is always just that.
Right. And part of company culture, and it's kind of what I want to focus on next, is also, fears and anxieties around making the right or wrong decisions, or creating tools that are doing jobs that traditionally people did within their org, and understanding how people need to reprioritize their time to better use these tools. And in doing all of this, I think we're all trying to make systems that are future proof. We don't want to rebuild these AI workflows again and again and again. We want to make it once and evaluate it and iterate on it. So that's part of justifying too, the ROI, and going back to creating the resources within your team for that to grow. So how can an engineering leader, perhaps someone who's in a company culture that's maybe more on the digital native side, they're have an appetite for risk and experimentation. Maybe they even have a little bit of resources. How can they shift those conversations with non-technical leadership from immediate gains to creating future-proof solutions that are going to help the company in maybe like a year or 5 years from now?
Yeah, I think it comes down to building trust. I think the first thing becomes like, as an engineering leader, I've talked to a lot of different leaders in the space, and it all comes down to number one, first having a gut instinct reaction, a gut instinct on their own side personally, like some kind of a trust that, these use cases are great, and this use case is actually going to be a good one to start with. The second is staff that, just go very, very fast and build out a prototype and start to see, does that actually add value? And then shop that around with others in your business. They could be leaders in the business, depending on how large the company is. So that, and you can now with Gen AI, the unlock is that you can build a prototype pretty quickly. And so you can at least start to get a sense for like, what is the appetite here? And that's typically what I've seen happen. And then from there, you can start to figure out what the KPIs are, right? Because the main thing is you want to be able to ship something pretty quickly. You want to go to production quickly with the right checks and balances in place. So you
Right.
start with like at least 1 to 2 use cases as quickly as you possibly can, with the right checks and balances and guardrails in place, and then start to see how that looks. Like, roll it out to 1%, 5%, 10%. Start to see what you learn, and then with that playbook, you can go very fast with everything else. This is exactly what we've seen with the largest banks in the world, as well as the digital natives. It's just that the digital natives are just moving much, much faster than the
Right.
largest banks. But this playbook is kind of similar on both sides.
It makes a lot of sense in terms of how those teams can get started. It's also about evaluating, going back to the evaluative frameworks from earlier and having measurements in place to look at the results week after week. And that creates within the company culture a healthy socialization and understanding of the tools that people are building and we're using. And that's what cultivates the trust. And I agree with you that that trust is really important, and it's also something really hard to find in an LLM based world. You know,
Yeah.
LLMs are stochastic; they don't want to repeat themselves. So when you put them into an environment where you want a repeatable workflow, where you have an AI agent evaluating things on the fly, there's so much to consider. And that's kind of part of the dauntingness of that I was alluding to earlier. There was in our initial conversation, there was something that you mentioned to me that's really resonated with me since, and is you mentioned how AI agents in the future, or even now, they can act as smart routers or kind of like load balancers for workflows and help optimize them over time. And that was really fascinating to me. I'm wondering if maybe you could dive into that a little more, just on a technical level. Now that we've talked about introducing these products and or these projects within your company, if you are somebody who's revolutionizing a workflow right now with AI, how should they best kind of think about it?
Yeah, especially with what I'll say is in terms of agents in particular, how that works. So, for context for folks, like Galileo is leading provider of evaluation tooling for any AI developer out there that's
Mhm.
building an AI app, right? And what that means is it's an eval basically includes not just the metrics, but also like the data set that you're working with. And it includes like a workflow so you can really understand what your failure modes are, build out evals around that, and then use that in your CI/CD process. So you know exactly if you're shipping a good product. And once you ship, you can check for regression tests. That's the net of how evals work. Um, now, within that, as with agents, what's interesting is we've kind of moved from people building like just chatbots. That was like it almost felt like that's just as far as the imagination could go in terms of use cases. To
Yeah.
now, it's like you can complete any task. What's the task that your product does? So we started seeing this with operators launch as well, which is a good example of an agent where all of a sudden I started to see Booking.com's folks talking about like, hey, now you can book a hotel room with just natural language. And then Box.com's CEOs started talking about how you can like add files and folders. So it just unlocked all these use cases for people. And that's kind of what we're seeing with agents come. Are they, are these apps perfect? No. And here's why. Because what's happening with agents is it's essentially a way to say like, hey, uh, LLM, instead of just generating something, why don't you just act towards choosing the right kind of tool? Or here's a function, I've wrapped it in a certain manner, do X for me, right? So making it do specific things. The tool function, the tool piece of this especially is interesting because now the API can act as you mentioned, as a smart router to figure out, which tool should I use for finishing this task, which is, I think, the biggest unlock right now. Because earlier you would just code all of that. You would like literally deterministically say, this is exactly what you need to do. Versus now it's almost like, I just want this done. You figure it out. You figure it out for me, which is also why there's almost like this, this, leader worker relationship almost with an agent that's happening.
Yeah.
Uh, and and so that's been the very big unlock because now these agents can just find out the right tool and go ahead. However, it does lead to different kinds of failure modes, right? Like, did it choose the right tool or not? And did the right tool get called in the right way or not? Even if it did choose the right tool, what happened after that? Can I see the entire flow of how all of that worked out? At the end of the day, did it complete the task? What do you mean by complete the task? How do you measure quality of task completion? Did it plan the whole task properly or not? So there's a bunch of these different kinds of qualitative stuff along the way that you need.
And they need to get
Judges,
evaluated in the evaluation system that we've been talking about. So
exactly,
all of those things need to get looked at because
exactly,
when you're in this environment where it's sitting as a router or it's making smart decisions, it's no longer like a chatbot where it's query response. Instead, it's request or demand, or like you need it to do something, and it's then a sequence of
ex-
actions. And those actions lack visibility to you. You're not staring at it making the decisions or the actions or making the API calls. You just see what it tells you at the end. So
yeah,
that's kind of where and that kind of goes back to building trust as
yeah,
well, because you need to understand what's happening in those stages.
yeah, exactly. It's funny how similar this is to working with a human being.
Yeah,
Uh,
exactly. That's what's coming to mind for me too. I really liked what you said about leaders and like contributors, about it kind of being this balance of the you as an engineer are overseeing the output or the work of the agent, and you're responsible for its success, just like how a manager is responsible for their IC's, success. You have
yeah.
to give it the right tools, the right environment, and the right context. So I think it's a big unlock. Are you kind of seeing that from folks that are starting to engage in these workflows?
We are, because that's exactly the kind of question that they're asking around like, hey, how do I make sure that everything worked fine? And also, if it did work fine and the answer is correct, can I see what the route was that it took? Because maybe it's just making unnecessary API calls that it doesn't have to in the first place. Can I optimize this even further? So there's a big like question around what are the failure modes, but also can I figure out what the can I have a visualization into like how the entire AI app like actually made its decisions and how it was planning, so I can maybe tweak things here and there. So the system itself, I think the folks at Databricks, Matej Zaharia coined the term compound systems
Mhm.
for what we at Galileo basically call your AI app. Um, that compound system is becoming more complex because of these agentic scenarios where essentially that's people are adding function calls. So it's fascinating because now it's even closer to classical software engineering, and it's all about like how good are your functions and how well are you managing it all. And those engineers come to us and they ask us about like, great, this is fun, but how do I? What is a unit test for me now, and what is a regression test for me now? And that's where evals come in.
Right. And getting to that, I'd like to understand a little more about how does Galileo open that box so that you look in to understand how those tools are working, and how somebody would use something like that to build confidence. Because what you're describing is like a whole new category to me of how we think about tools. And when you're in an environment where you're defining a novel category that's really you have to do a lot of like definition setting and understanding. So we're all for the first time opening the box and looking inside on workflows that we're building now for the first time. What does Galileo provide? What are the things that people should be looking for?
So what Galileo tries to do is our end goal is to help you build high quality AI apps fast. That's our end goal. So we win if you're building those apps like 10x faster and those apps are 10x better. That's our goal. Now, in order to do that, that includes what I think of as the visualization layer, meaning like you could just see your traces and spans. I feel like that's the easy part. It's good for them, but it's highly commoditizable, right? Anybody can build that thing. So we obsess about the user experience at that layer. But then
Mhm.
beyond that, what we've been seeing is we initially gave the developers the ability to just build their own metrics as well and score their agents. And what we saw was developers struggled with that because they kind of had an idea about like, hey, I need to see if it's planned this thing out well enough. But then in order to build that metric, they almost had to build a very complex prompt. They had to kind of find the right kind of
Mhm.
to add in it. They had to figure out the instructions. They had to figure out how to optimize this. Do I use a GPT-4 model for this? Something else? So that's the layer where we basically realize that wait, this is actually ripe for a lot of research. So we have a fairly large staff of AI researchers that are constantly working on what we call our Luna evaluation metrics, where it's not just the prompt instructions and things of that nature, but we also focus a lot on how can we optimize the cost and latency of these different metrics. So what does this mean for the user? What this means is I've built my agent and I'm building my agent. It's in my IDE, right? You could just use Galileo's TypeScript SDK or JavaScript SDK to be able to start logging your application. And then on the other side, without any ground truth needed, you basically magically see not just the visualization layer, but you also start to see two things. One, you'll see these very, very highly explainable uh, metrics show up with an explanation for exactly what went wrong and why. The second thing that you see are automatic insights as well, which are fairly easy to understand. Because what we want to do essentially as a developer, what they want as well, is I just am trying to build this agent out. I cobbled together a few things. I'm trying to run a quick experiment. Um, which part of this complex compound system should I focus on? Should I focus on this API, that one, the prompt, or something else? And so we basically dumb it all down for them as much as we can and tell them like, we have all your logs. We also have these metrics that we built out based on all of this. Here's what we think you should do. So it's almost like a co-pilot for your AI application development. That's the journey we want to go with them on as they're going from like building towards scaling.
That's very fascinating to me because when someone's going to look at all of these different variables, what Galileo is doing is it's helping you isolate those variables and find the ones that are going to have the biggest impact for you to focus on, which
Yeah.
kind of resonates with like the whole top line objective of folks having to or being in a position where they are experimenting with AI or building workflows as they're trying to evaluate and justify where they should be spending their time because it's moving so quickly that
Yeah.
all their time always needs to be spent on the most impactful part of the project, or anything else you're working on is likely just you're adding risk to the project because you're doing things that are probably going to be outdated by the time they're really in practice or really in use.
Yeah.
And that requires like a whole mental, I think, flip about how we build and how we look at them. So it helps you isolate the variables and make those tools a little more natural to develop in a classical way where you can
Yeah.
evaluate and understand.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I agree with you. That's exactly right.
And when someone is maybe building and managing a bunch of these AI bots or tools or workflows, you know, are you seeing that it's like people are like almost like doing performance evaluations on their agents? Like maybe like how somebody would do for maybe someone's getting ramped up, right, as a BDR or as a customer success manager, and there's, basic tenets that you want them to do across the board, and you're evaluating their interactions with customers or whatnot, and because you understand what is good and what is bad in the environment of your company's culture.
Yeah.
Are you seeing that that's how people are using and evolving as they build these tools?
Yeah. It's similar. It's very similar because, to take your example for a second, like let's say you hire an SDR. The SDR is mostly focused on outbounding, and then you got to see the quality of their outbound, who they outbounded to, what the result of that was, did they book a call or not, and all
Right.
sorts of stuff. There's an entire funnel there. Imagine all of that's being done by like an AI agent. That AI agent's basically going to have to do a bunch of different kinds of API calls to make sure all of that happens. And now the question becomes, great, if it's an AI agent that's not sleeping at night, then how do I make sure that there's some sense of potential failure modes that can happen? You would probably do this with the SDR as well, the human SDR, where you'd probably want to have like some kind of inspection, right? You have an expectation setting. I want you to book 10 calls this week. That's my expectation. And then with a
Mhm.
human, you have some level of inspection around, great, like how many outbound calls did you do today? And then I'm going to start to look at a funnel. Um, it's similar. You come up with that mental model of what those potential failure modes would be, as the person who's building the app, and then you have to build out the guardrails accordingly. And then what happens is, as you go through the motion of interacting with that human SDR or the agent or the AI agent, you start to figure out more failure modes because you go deeper and deeper and deeper. You're like, oh shit, this can go wrong, that can go wrong, and then on the fly, you're gonna have to create more evals and more metrics, and you also start generating more data around like, like when it's trying to reach out to this specific kind of person with this specific queue, that's when it's failing. So maybe I should isolate this data a little bit. That's when you start to create like this data set that you want to test against and these metrics. So that's the flow that people have been going down of like exploring and creating
Yeah.
these emails and making it part
What
of their process.
what really stands out to me about that is it can get very complex, and it sounds like a whole new set of skills even. And from your perspective, what do you think is the most powerful habit or skill that an engineer or an engineering leader should be picking up right now to stay ahead of this kind of curve?
You have to build. I think the best engineering leaders that I've seen, they're doing two things right now. They're building. They're reading up. They're keeping themselves upskilled. I think everyone has to do that. I certainly do that all the time.
Yep.
Everyone has to do that. And especially if you're expecting your team to build out these kinds of AI apps, you have to get very, very familiar with it. That's one very large part of it. Um, and the second piece is just also just I guess the best way to think of this is being in touch with the community, like learning from each other. Because I've noticed that organizations that are moving really fast are the ones where they have eng leaders who are also talking to other eng leaders about what they have learned really really quickly. Because everything's moving so quickly, you can't wait to make those mistakes yourselves, right? So I'm seeing folks where there's like a good cross pollination amongst leaders that they're moving much much faster. It could be that an eng leader might tell somebody else that, hey, you should get Galileo because without evals, it's going to be really bad. And the other one's going to probably learn that the hard way. It has happened with a lot of engineering leaders before. So I feel like those two things are very, very important. Keep being at the forefront of learning by doing, because you're an engineering leader. Dust off those skills, and you can actually build simple apps on the side. And the second one is just being a big part of the community somehow, being in touch.
Build, read, and communicate.
Yeah.
3 core defining traits. And
Yeah.
that's a really powerful takeaway. For me, what really stands out about that is that people who put in place small incremental changes over time, they get ahead faster and faster. In an incremental world like AI, somebody who's building that tool yesterday is going to be much more ahead of you tomorrow if you didn't build it. So those engineers that are out there building and talking about what they're building, and they're reading about what other people are building, those are the ones that are getting ahead and are staying on the forefront. And I that's a really great takeaway. And Vikram, this has been an incredible conversation. There's so much insight packed into what we talked about today. I want to thank you for sharing and giving our listeners some actionable takeaways. But before we wrap up, where can our audience go to learn more about Galileo and the work that you're doing?
Yeah, for sure. So we are at galileo.ai. You can also check us out on LinkedIn and on Twitter. We post a lot of content on our website, and we put that in our blogs and the website. There's a lot of there's an entire research section where we publish our papers and everything else that we worked on for AI evals. We've been around for 4 years, so there's a rich history of a large body of work there. So they can check it out there. We're also hiring right now for a lot of for a lot of engineers who've built out their own AI apps. So excited to chat with anybody who's interested in being at the forefront of helping builders build, basically.
That's fantastic to hear, and I'll include those notes in the show notes on Substack. So if you listen to this and you're interested in getting involved with Galileo or following up on anything that we talked about today, please be sure to subscribe, share our episode. You've made it this far, and if you check out our Substack, there's even more insights from today's discussion. And we'd also love to hear from you on socials, so don't be a stranger. And that's it for this week's Dev Interrupted. We'll see you next time.